Hello, welcome to Beloved Blackness, week 16. I'm Dr. B. So the past few weeks we have been talking about this notion of culture, and Dr. Wade Nobles, an African-centered psychologist and scholar, talks about the three different layers of culture. So he talks about the manifestations as the surface layers, then aspects, and then factors. And those factors are more the philosophical underpinnings of culture that often don't get discussed. We usually focus just upon those manifestations like rituals or beliefs, or foods, customs, those sorts of things. And those are merely just the expressions, not to trivialize them, but those are the expressions of these deeper layers of culture. So I'm wanting in us thinking about how to embrace who we are as people of African descent. Think about these deeper layers. So the last few weeks I started off talking about ontology. So that's the essence of being. And we said an African ontology sees the essence of being through the lens of spirit. Or another word is called consubstantiation, which is of the same essence or of the same spirit. Okay, so the world that we live in is one in which spirit undergirds it. Okay, then we also talked about cosmology, which is the structure of reality. And we talked about an African cosmology is one where there's interdependence and interconnectedness, all right? Not a sense of separateness, but a sense of interconnectedness and interdependence within nature, within people, within life in and of itself. So today we're going to talk about axiology as one of those factors or deeper layer expressions of culture in terms of a cultural structure. Axiology. And what axiology is what is the value system that's guiding relationships? And so the axiology, African axiology, is one in which person to person is the most valued relationship that we can think of, or that gets expressed, not that we can think of, that it gets expressed. And so when we think about person to person, we think of being in harmony, and even some of the other cultural factors that we talked about in terms of ontology and cosmology, you can see how they all relate, right? Because if we have a sense of consubstantiation in terms of the ontological way in which African cultural understanding relates and thinks about the universe, that of the same essence, the spirit, then it makes sense that axiologically we will relate to one another from a person to person way of being, as opposed to a person or object. That if you see the material as the essence of reality, then you'll relate to that which is outside of your person in an object way, as opposed to within an African worldview, it's with if the same substance, if you have a person who is from your cultural group who is struggling, then you see that person and you can identify with them of being of the same essence, then you would want to do something to be of service to them. You remember I gave the analogy or the example of Colin Kaepernick last week. And so when I thought about axiology today in terms of our highest value lies in the interpersonal relationship for people of African descent, that I thought about this recent development where there are mental health clinicians who are starting to do psychotherapy via video and like Skype sessions, those sorts of things. And I've been kind of struggling with even trying to be open to, let's see if that's something I would even want to consider. And I can't get past my internal nope. And so much of that is not just based on how I work clinically now, but it's also based on my African sense of who I am, that to have a felt experience of who the person is in the room is really important in terms of that person-to-person connection. And I don't think that that can be fully captured through a Skype, because the essence of who we are comes through and is manifested in all of who we are, including our spirit. And so to try to capture that or to try to engage with that through a video mechanism doesn't quite reflect not only in terms of those deeper layers that I like to work with patients on, but also it doesn't seem to connect in terms of my cultural orientation. And so when I think of axiology in terms of that value, a person-to-person relationship is the highest value within an African axiological structure. That's an example that came to mind for me this week. So over the course of the next week, think of the ways in which an African axiological structure is manifested in your life. And I've got gotten some feedback where people saying, well, that's how it used to be, right? So part of the origins for Beloved Blackness is the idea that the Ma'afa, right, the destruction beyond human comprehension, disaster and destruction beyond human comprehension that Dr. Marimba Ani talks about in describing the kidnapping and enslaving of our African ancestors and all the brutality, subsequent brutality from that, that there's a rupture. And part of the rupture was intentional. Remember Dr. Linda James Myers' 4 phases of oppression. So part of the intentionality is to take us away from being aware of our history, our knowledge of ourselves, so that our African cultural essence, although still there, gets mired by the trauma. So part of wanting to recapture the belovedness of who we are as people of African descent is trying to understand those deeper layers of who our cultural selves are so that we can recapture them in a more conscious way, even though it still lives on within us. But we have to be very intentional about cultivating and developing the soil of our African selves. All right, so until next week, axiology, highest value is within relationships is between person to person. All right.